A mother's intuition and a forgotten past. The golden hues of dusk spilled into Ada Carter's small but cozy living room, painting the walls in a soft amber glow. Outside, the autumn wind rustled the last few leaves clinging to the branches, sending them spiraling toward the ground like faded memories drifting away. Ada sat in her armchair by the window, staring at the elegant envelope that lay on the table before her. She had received many letters in her lifetime, some filled with love, others with sorrow, but none had made her hands tremble quite like this one. The invitation bore intricate gold filigree, the kind reserved for the grandest of occasions. The calligraphy was delicate yet firm, a sign of meticulous craftsmanship. With a deep breath, she picked it up and carefully opened it. "You are cordially invited to the wedding of Ethan Carter and Isabel Monroe." Her son, her Ethan. A bittersweet smile tugged at the corners of her lips. It seemed like just yesterday that she was holding him in her arms, saying him lullabies on sleepless nights. And now he was about to start a new chapter of his life, with a woman Ada had never met. She had always imagined that when Ethan found love, he would share every little detail with her. She had pictured late-night calls filled with excited chatter, weekends spent introducing his love to the family, and whispered secrets about wedding plans. But instead, Ethan had been distant. Ada had only heard Isabel's name in passing. There had been no long conversations, no heartfelt confessions about how they met or what made her special. When she had asked, Ethan had simply said, "She's wonderful, Mom. You'll love her." Something about his tone had unsettled her, not because he seemed unhappy, but because he seemed careful, cautious. And that was what worried her. She traced the edge of the invitation with her fingertips, deep in thought. Her memories flickered back to the past, to a time when her life had been filled with more than just Ethan, to a time when she had been a mother of two. A lump formed in her throat as she reached for the old photo album resting on the nearby bookshelf. The leather cover was worn, its edges softened by years of handling. As she flipped through the pages, she came across a picture that never failed to break her heart. A little girl with dark curls and a mischievous smile. Lily. Ada swallowed hard, her vision blurring with unshed tears. Her daughter had been everything. Vibrant, full of life, a force of nature in a tiny body. She could still remember the way Lily's laughter filled their home, the way her little hands would tug at Ada's skirt, begging for one more bedtime story. And then, one summer day, she was gone. Vanished. It had been a family outing to the beach, a rare day when life had felt perfect. The sound of waves crashing against the shore, the scent of salt in the air, children's laughter carried on the wind. It had all been so beautiful. But in the blink of an eye, everything changed. One moment, Lily was playing near the water, and the next, she was missing. Ada had screamed her name until her throat was raw. Strangers joined in the search. Lifeguards combed the shore, but there was no sign of her. No footprints leading away. No witnesses who had seen anything suspicious. Just gone. And despite the countless missing person reports, the sleepless nights spent praying, and the endless searches, Ada had never found closure. Only grief. Her fingers brushed over the photo, lingering on the small but unmistakable crescent-shaped birthmark just below Lily's collarbone. It had always reminded Ada of the moon, a mark as unique as her daughter herself. She exhaled shakily, closing the album. It had been years, decades, and though time had softened the pain, it had never erased it. Pushing the memories aside, she forced herself to focus on the present. Ethan was getting married, and she needed to be there for him. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in her chest. Something about this wedding felt strange. She didn't know why, but a mother's intuition was rarely wrong. And she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, from her past was about to come rushing back into her life, whether she was ready for it or not. The wedding ceremony and a mother's instinct. The grand estate stood like a relic from another era, tall, regal, and adorned with intricate stonework that whispered of old money and generations past. Massive chandeliers sparkled through the high-arched windows, casting golden reflections on the marble floors. The grounds were immaculate, with sprawling gardens, cascading fountains, and winding paths that seemed to lead into a world untouched by time. Etta Carter stepped out of the car, clutching her small purse tightly in her hands. Her heart thudded against her ribs, a steady, anxious rhythm she couldn't ignore. She had attended many weddings in her lifetime, but something about this one felt different. It wasn't just the unfamiliar setting or the sheer grandeur of the occasion. It was the unshakable feeling deep in her bones, something she couldn't quite explain. A whisper at the back of her mind telling her that today was more than just a wedding. It was the beginning of something she wasn't prepared for. A mother's first look at the bride. The guests were already gathering, their laughter and chatter filling the air as they moved toward the grand outdoor ceremony space. White roses and peonies lined the aisle, their scent mingling with the crisp autumn air. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, sending a few spiraling to the ground like nature's own confetti. Ada barely noticed. She was searching for one person, the bride. As if sensing her thoughts, a soft voice interrupted her. "Mom." She turned, and there stood Ethan. Her son had always been handsome, but today he looked different, sharper, more refined in his black-tailored suit. His dark brown hair, always a little tousled, had been neatly styled, and there was a spark of excitement in his eyes. He looked happy. But beneath that happiness, Ada saw something else. A hesitation, a nervousness. She reached for his hand instinctively. "Are you all right, my love?" Ethan chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, just nervous, I guess. Big day and all." Ada studied him for a moment. "Are you sure that's all it is?" Ethan's smile faltered just slightly. It was almost imperceptible, but Ada caught it. He glanced away for just a fraction of a second before nodding. "Of course, Mom. Don't worry. Everything's perfect." A lie. She knew her son too well. But before she could press further, the soft notes of the violin signaled the arrival of the bride. Everyone turned toward the grand arched entrance. And then Isabel appeared. Ada's breath caught in her throat. The bride was stunning, her dress a masterpiece of lace and satin that cascaded around her like liquid moonlight. Dark curls framed her delicate face, pinned in an elegant updo that allowed soft tendrils to fall effortlessly around her collarbone. Her deep brown eyes sparkled under the sunlight, filled with something Ada couldn't quite place: excitement, nervousness. Then Ada's gaze fell on something else, something that made her stomach lurch. Just below the delicate lace of Isabel's neckline, barely visible against her porcelain skin, was a mark. A birthmark. A crescent shape. Ada's breath hitched. Her vision blurred as memories slammed into her with the force of a tidal wave. The laughter of a little girl. Tiny arms wrapped around her neck. The warm scent of baby shampoo. The gentle rise and fall of her daughter's chest as she slept, safe in her mother's arms. And that mark. That unmistakable crescent-shaped birthmark. It was Lily's. Ada's heart pounded so violently, she thought she might collapse. No, it wasn't possible. It couldn't be. She felt the world tilt beneath her as she clutched the back of a chair for support. Her daughter was gone. Taken. Lost forever. And yet, her mind screamed that it was a coincidence, that it had to be. But in her heart, in the deepest part of her soul, she knew. She knew exactly what she was looking at. And she knew exactly who this bride was. A mother's doubt and a daughter's mystery. The ceremony began, but Ada barely heard the officiant's words. She barely saw the way Ethan gazed at Isabel with adoration, the way Isabel's lips curled into a nervous but genuine smile as she said her vows. She was too lost in the storm raging inside her. Her hands trembled as she clutched the fabric of her dress, her pulse thrumming wildly against her ribs. She had to be wrong. She had to be imagining things. But the mark was there. And the way Isabel carried herself, The way she touched her collarbone absent-mindedly, as if the mark meant something to her, sent a chill down Ada's spine. She needed answers, and she needed them now. As the ceremony ended and guests began making their way to the reception hall, Ada waited for her moment. She watched as Isabel laughed softly with a friend, her voice light, her movements graceful. There was something achingly familiar about her. Ada's hands clenched. She had spent decades mourning her daughter. If there was even the slightest chance that Lily was alive, that she was standing right in front of her, she had to find out the truth, even if it destroyed everything. The unanswered questions. As Ada took a shaky step forward, Ethan appeared at her side. "Mom, you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Ada blinked rapidly, pulling herself together. "Yes, sweetheart. I'd like to speak with Isabel, just for a moment." Ethan smiled. "Of course. I'd love for you two to get to know each other." He led her across the grand ballroom, the chandeliers above casting glittering light over the scene. And then, Ada stood face to face with Isabel Monroe, the woman she suspected was her long-lost daughter, and the woman about to marry her son. Ada swallowed hard. "Mrs. Carter," Isabel greeted warmly, her voice soft. "It's such an honor to finally meet you." Ada searched her face, looking for something, anything, that might confirm or deny the impossible thought swirling in her mind. Instead, all she could manage was a whisper. "Have we met before?" Isabel frowned slightly, tilting her head. "I don't think so," she said gently. "But for some reason, you do seem familiar." Ada's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a coincidence, and something told her that whatever truth lay buried in Isabel's past, it was about to change everything. The shadows of the past. The reception hall was a masterpiece of elegance. Tall ceilings adorned with golden chandeliers, tables draped in pristine white linens, and crystal glasses that sparkled under the warm glow of candlelight. Soft classical music hummed in the background as guests clinked glasses and exchanged laughter. But for Ada, the beauty of the evening was lost in the storm raging within her. She could barely hear the cheerful conversations around her, the scent of fresh roses, the sound of champagne being poured. It all felt distant, muted, as if she were trapped in a fog. Across the room, Isabel laughed at something Ethan whispered in her ear, her smile radiant, her eyes filled with love. And yet, all Ada could see was the past. The little girl she had lost, the daughter she had mourned for years, the child who had vanished into thin air. The crescent-shaped birthmark on Isabel's collarbone had shattered everything Ada thought she knew. But how could it be possible? She needed answers, and she needed them now. A mother's instinct. Ada took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She couldn't let her emotions get the best of her. Not here, not now. If she confronted Isabel recklessly, she might ruin Ethan's wedding day. But she had to know the truth. Summoning her strength, she made her way toward the newlyweds. Ethan spotted her first, his expression softening. "Mom," he said, wrapping an arm around her shoulder, "I was just about to come find you. I want you to get to know Isabel better." Ada forced a smile. "I'd love that." Isabel turned toward her, her dark eyes warm. "I'm so happy to finally meet you, Mrs. Carter. Ethan speaks about you all the time." Ada studied her closely, every movement, every gesture, every flicker of emotion across her face. She was looking for something, anything, that would confirm her suspicion. And then, Isabel did something that made Ada's heart skip a beat. As she reached up to tuck a loose curl behind her ear, her fingers brushed absent-mindedly over the birthmark on her collarbone. It was such a small, instinctive movement. But Ada recognized it, because Lily used to do the same thing. It was something she had seen 100 times before, her daughter absent-mindedly touching the mark whenever she was deep in thought. Ada's throat tightened. This wasn't just a coincidence. She had to be sure. A subtle test. Ada smiled, keeping her voice light. You look beautiful, Isabel. There's something familiar about you. Isabel blinked in surprise. Really? She let out a soft laugh. That's funny. I felt the same way when I first saw you. Ada's pulse quickened. Tell me, she said carefully, where did you grow up? Ethan raised an eyebrow. Mom, are you trying to interrogate my wife? He joked. Ada chuckled, feigning amusement. Of course not, dear. Just curious. Isabel's expression became thoughtful. I actually don't know much about my early childhood. I was adopted when I was around 4 or 5. My parents, well, my adoptive parents, always told me they found me at an orphanage overseas. I don't remember much before that. Ada's heart slammed against her ribs. 4 or 5 years old, right around the time Lily had gone missing. The air seemed to thin, and for a moment, she struggled to breathe. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. She had to tread carefully. Did your adoptive parents ever tell you where you were before the orphanage? Ada asked, keeping her voice casual. Isabel frowned, clearly trying to recall. Not really. Just that it was in a different country, somewhere far away. I don't even know my birth name. She shrugged. But honestly, I've never thought too much about it. My adoptive parents gave me a wonderful life, and I never felt like anything was missing. Ada forced a smile, but her mind was spinning. She needed proof, and there was only one way to get it. A plan for the truth. Throughout the evening, Ada stayed close to Isabel, studying her every move, listening intently to every detail she shared about her past. But she needed something more concrete. As guests began to dance and laughter filled the air, Ada carefully reached into her purse and pulled out a small item. A tissue-wrapped object she had brought with her that morning, though she hadn't known why. A necklace. It was a tiny silver pendant in the shape of a moon. The last thing Lily had worn before she disappeared. Ada approached Isabel, her fingers tightening around the chain. My dear, she said warmly, I have something for you. Isabel looked at her in surprise. Oh, Mrs. Carter, you didn't have to. It's just a small gift, Ada interrupted softly, unwrapping the necklace and holding it out. Something old, something that belonged to someone very special to me. Isabel's gaze fell on the pendant, and then something happened. Her entire body stiffened. Her expression flickered, just for a moment, with something unreadable. Shock, confusion, recognition. Her hand instinctively went to her collarbone, as if something deep inside her was stirring. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, I've seen this before. The world stopped. Ada's breath caught. You have? Isabel frowned, as if trying to pull a distant memory from the depths of her mind. I don't know how, but it feels familiar. She hesitated, like something from a dream. Ada's hands trembled. It wasn't a dream. It was a memory that had been buried for years. Her daughter was standing right in front of her, and she didn't even know it. The past begins to unravel. Before Ada could say another word, a voice called out, Isabel, sweetheart, come meet my uncle, Ethan. Isabel blinked, snapping out of her trance. She shot Ada a quick smile. Excuse me for just a moment. As she disappeared into the crowd, Ada's knees nearly gave out. She needed to find out the truth. She needed proof. And there was only one way to get it. A DNA test. Ada clenched the necklace in her hand, her decision made. If Isabel truly was Lily, then the person who had stolen her all those years ago had to be out there. And they had to pay for what they had done. Unraveling the past. The evening unfolded in a blur of music, laughter, and celebration. But for Ada, time seemed to slow. Every moment, every glance, every word Isabel spoke only added to the growing suspicion in her heart. This was her daughter. She knew it with every fiber of her being. But how? How had Lily, her little girl, ended up as Isabel Monroe, standing before her as a grown woman, completely unaware of the life she had lost? The questions burned inside her, suffocating her beneath the weight of the past. A silent investigation. As the reception carried on, Ada forced herself to move carefully, cautiously. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. If she was wrong, she would shatter not only her own heart, but Ethan's happiness as well. And if she was right, then someone had taken her daughter, and they had to be held accountable. Ada knew she needed proof, so she turned to the one place where answers often hid: family history. She began observing the people surrounding Isabel, paying close attention to those she called family. Isabel's adoptive parents, Richard and Margaret Monroe, were an elegant couple in their late 50s, the kind of people who carried themselves with quiet sophistication. Richard, a tall, silver-haired businessman, had an air of authority, while Margaret was softer, her gentle blue eyes crinkling at the corners whenever she smiled. They seemed like good people, but something about them made Ada uneasy. She waited for the right moment, then approached Margaret when she was momentarily alone near the refreshment table. "Mrs. Monroe," Ada said, keeping her tone friendly, "I just wanted to say how lovely Isabel looks tonight. You must be so proud." Margaret beamed. "Oh, we are. She's our little angel." Little angel. The word sent a pang through Ada's heart. She took a sip of her water, feigning casual interest. "Ethan mentioned Isabel was adopted. I'd love to hear the story." Margaret hesitated. It was only for a second, but Ada caught it. "Oh, well," Margaret began, her smile faltering just slightly. "It was so long ago. We found her in an orphanage overseas when she was about 4. The adoption process took some time, but from the moment we brought her home, she was ours." Ada's heart pounded. Where was the orphanage? Margaret hesitated again. "South America," she said quickly, her fingers tightening around her champagne glass. "It's all a bit of a blur now, honestly. So many years have passed." A blur? Ada knew what a blur felt like. It felt like losing a child on a crowded beach. It felt like years of searching, of hopelessness, of wondering if she was still alive. For a mother, the details of when and where you first held your child were never a blur. Margaret was lying. A risky decision. Ada's mind raced. If Isabel was Lily, then someone had orchestrated her disappearance. Someone had taken her from that beach all those years ago. And now, the pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. The only thing left to do was to prove it. Ada needed something concrete, something irrefutable. A DNA test. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She couldn't just ask Isabel for a sample without raising suspicion. And she couldn't risk Ethan thinking she had lost her mind. She had to be discreet. That night, while the wedding guests danced and celebrated, Ada excused herself from the festivities and slipped upstairs to the bridal suite, where Isabel had prepared earlier in the day. She had one goal: to find anything that could give her the DNA sample she needed. A used tissue, a strand of hair, a toothbrush. She searched quickly but methodically, scanning the vanity table where Isabel's makeup and accessories were neatly arranged. Then she spotted it. A hairbrush. Dark strands of hair were woven between the bristles, a perfect sample for testing. Ada's fingers trembled as she carefully plucked a few strands, wrapping them in a tissue and tucking them into her purse. She had done it. Now, all she needed was her own sample to compare. And then the truth would finally come to light. A mother's nightmare. Ada returned to the reception, her heart still racing. She had barely taken her seat when a voice startled her. "Mrs. Carter." She turned to find Richard Monroe standing beside her, his piercing gaze fixed on her. "I couldn't help but notice you speaking with my wife earlier," he said smoothly, his expression unreadable. Ada forced a smile. "Yes, just getting to know Isabel's family." Richard nodded slowly. "Is that all?" There was something in his voice, something that sent a chill down Ada's spine. Did he suspect something? "I've heard a lot about you," Richard continued, his voice lowering. "Ethan tells us you're a very intuitive woman." Ada studied him carefully. A mother always trusts her instincts. Richard's lips curved slightly. Yes, I imagine she does. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Ada unsettled. Something wasn't right. And she had a feeling Richard Monroe knew more than he was letting on. The final confirmation. 2 days later, Ada sat in a small clinic, the DNA samples sealed inside an envelope. The waiting was unbearable. Every second felt like an eternity. And then, finally, the results arrived. She unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the words. And the world stopped. 99.9% probability of maternity. Isabel was her daughter. Lily was alive. Tears blurred Ada's vision. She gripped the paper so tightly it crinkled beneath her fingers. All these years, all the suffering, all the prayers whispered into the night. Her daughter had been right in front of her the entire time. But now, a new fear gripped her heart. If Isabel was Lily, then someone had stolen her. And that meant someone had to pay. The web of deception. Ada sat frozen in the clinic's waiting room, the DNA test results clutched in her trembling hands. Her daughter was alive. Isabel was Lily. She wanted to burst into tears, to run straight to her and tell her everything, to hold her, to finally bring her home. But the truth was far more complicated than that. Someone had stolen Lily from her. Someone had raised her under a false name. And that someone had to be held accountable. Ada took a deep breath, wiping away her tears as she steadied herself. There was only one person who could give her the answers she needed. Richard Monroe. A confrontation with lies. That evening, Ada arrived at the Monroe estate. The house was a grand structure, towering behind a wrought iron gate, its pristine white walls gleaming under the setting sun. A place of wealth, of power, of secrets. Margaret greeted her at the door, her expression warm but puzzled. "Mrs. Carter, what a surprise. Is everything all right?" "I need to speak with your husband," Ada said firmly. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. He's in his study." She led Ada through the lavish halls, past paintings and elegant chandeliers, until they reached a set of mahogany double doors. She knocked lightly before pushing them open. Richard was seated behind an ornate desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up, his sharp blue eyes locking onto Ada's. "Mrs. Carter," he said smoothly, setting his glass down. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Ada stepped inside, her heart pounding. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "I know the truth." Richard arched an eyebrow. "The truth." Ada took a step closer, gripping the DNA test results. "Isabel is my daughter." There was a brief flicker in Richard's eyes, something unreadable, something dark. Ada pressed on. "She's Lily, the little girl who was taken from me all those years ago." Her voice shook with emotion. "And I need to know how she ended up in your care." Richard exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out." The casual way he said it sent a chill through Ada's spine. "You admit it," she whispered, barely able to contain her rage. Richard smiled. "What exactly do you think happened, Mrs. Carter?" Ada's nails dug into her palm. "I think someone stole my daughter from that beach, and I think you had something to do with it." Richard chuckled. "You're a sharp woman. I can see where Ethan gets his intelligence." He stood, walking toward the bar in the corner of the room. Ada watched him pour another glass of whiskey, her patience wearing thin. "Tell me the truth," she demanded. "Was it you? Did you take her?" Richard took a slow sip of his drink, then turned to face her. "No," he said simply. "I didn't take her." Ada's breath caught. "Then who did?" Richard tilted his head. "Margaret." The world seemed to tilt. "What?" Richard set his glass down, his expression unreadable. "My wife took your daughter." Ada stumbled back. "No, that's not possible." But deep down, something in her had already suspected it. The hesitation in Margaret's voice when she talked about Isabel's past. The way she had rushed through the details of the adoption, the unease Ada had felt around her. Margaret had known the truth all along. Richard sighed, swirling his whiskey in his glass. Margaret was desperate for a child. We had tried for years. IVF, specialists, everything. But it never worked. She was devastated. His voice lowered. Then, one day, she came home with a little girl. A beautiful child, no older than 4. Ada's hands clenched into fists. She told me she had found her at an orphanage, Richard continued, that we were meant to be her parents. He let out a humorless chuckle. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. He met Ada's eyes. But deep down, I always suspected something wasn't right. Ada's voice trembled with rage. You stole my child. Richard exhaled, rubbing his temple. It was Margaret. She never told me where she got her, only that she was ours now. And his voice faltered. I let it happen. Ada could barely breathe. Her daughter had been ripped from her arms, raised by another woman while she had spent years drowning in grief. And now, that woman had to answer for what she had done. A mother's fury. Where is she? Ada's voice was ice. Richard hesitated. Margaret is at a charity gala tonight. Ada turned on her heel, storming toward the door. Richard's voice stopped her. Mrs. Carter. She turned back, fire in her eyes. He hesitated. Please, don't hurt her. Ada stared at him in disbelief. Don't hurt her. She repeated, her voice shaking with fury. She stole my baby. Richard looked away. I know, and I'll never forgive myself for letting it happen. But she truly loves Isabel. In her own twisted way, she thought she was saving her. Ada's chest heaved. She didn't save her, she spat. She stole her. Without another word, she walked out. A truth that changes everything. The gala was an extravagant affair. Elegant gowns, sparkling chandeliers, and a live orchestra filling the ballroom with music. But Ada had no time for luxury. She spotted Margaret near the dance floor, chatting with guests. Taking a deep breath, Ada marched toward her. Margaret. Margaret turned, her face lighting up, until she saw the look in Ada's eyes. Mrs. Carter, she said, her voice cautious. What are you doing here? Ada held up the DNA results. I know. Margaret's face drained of color. I know you stole my daughter. The room seemed to shrink, the music fading into the background. Margaret swallowed hard. You took Lily from me. Ada hissed, stepping closer. You raised her as Isabel, and you let me believe she was dead. Margaret's hands trembled. I can explain. Explain. Ada's voice cracked. How do you explain stealing a child? Tears filled Margaret's eyes. I never meant to hurt anyone. I saw her on that beach, and she looked so alone. No one was watching her. Ada's stomach twisted. She had been watching. She had only looked away for a second. Margaret's voice wavered. I was desperate for a child. I told myself she had been abandoned, that I was rescuing her. Ada's hands curled into fists. You lied to yourself. Margaret's face crumpled. I know. Tears streamed down her face. I know what I did was wrong. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But please don't take her away from me. Ada's breath caught. She had spent years dreaming of this moment, of finding Lily, of confronting the person who took her. And now it was here. But the real battle had just begun. Because now she had to tell Isabel the truth. And she had no idea how she would react. A truth that cannot be ignored. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on Ada's chest. Margaret Monroe, her daughter's captor, the woman who had stolen Lily from her, was now standing before her, pleading. Pleading not to be exposed. Pleading to keep the daughter she had never deserved. But Ada had already lost too much. She wasn't about to let her daughter remain in the hands of the woman who had stolen her. Still, a much harder battle lay ahead. Isabel, The daughter Ada had mourned, prayed for, and desperately sought for years, didn't know the truth, and how she would react was the greatest unknown of all. A choice that would change everything. Margaret wiped her tears and looked at Ada, desperation in her eyes. "Please," she whispered, "don't take her from me." Ada's fists clenched at her sides. "You took her from me." Margaret's shoulders sagged. "I know, and I will never be able to undo what I've done. But she loves me. She doesn't know you." Those words cut Ada to the bone. She was right. Isabel didn't know her. To Isabel, Ada was nothing more than her fiance's mother, a stranger, not the woman who had given birth to her, raised her for 3 years, and cried for her every single night for over 2 decades. Ada took a deep, shuddering breath. "I will not let this lie continue," she said. "Isabel deserves to know the truth." Margaret paled. "She will hate me." "She should." Margaret squeezed her eyes shut, as if bracing for impact. "I don't care how you feel, Margaret," Ada continued. "I only care about my daughter." Margaret opened her mouth, but Ada didn't give her the chance to respond. Without another word, she turned on her heel and left, her heart pounding with both rage and dread. The hardest part was still ahead. Telling Isabel the truth. That evening, Ada sat in Ethan's apartment, waiting. Isabel had agreed to meet after Ada told Ethan she needed to talk to her alone. She had no idea how this conversation was going to go, but she had to try. A soft knock at the door made Ada's breath hitch. This was it. She rose to her feet and opened the door. Isabel stood there, her face filled with curiosity and mild concern. "Mrs. Carter," she greeted with a soft smile. "Ethan said you wanted to talk." Ada stepped aside. "Come in, dear." Isabel entered and took a seat on the couch. "Is everything okay?" Ada sat across from her, gripping the DNA test results in her hands. She had rehearsed this moment in her head 1,000 times, but now that she was here, the words felt impossible. Still, she had no choice. Taking a deep breath, she finally spoke. "Isabel, what I'm about to tell you is going to change everything." Isabel frowned slightly, but she nodded. "Okay." Ada's throat tightened. "This isn't easy to say, but you were taken from your real family as a child." Isabel blinked. "What?" Ada's voice wavered. "I'm your mother, Isabel." Silence. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Isabel let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. That's not possible." Ada reached forward and placed the DNA results in Isabel's trembling hands. "Read it." Isabel hesitated, but her eyes slowly moved over the paper. Then she stopped. Her breath caught. Her hand started shaking. 99.9% probability, she whispered. Her gaze shot up, wide and disbelieving. "This is a mistake." Ada's heart broke at the panic in her voice. "No, my love," Ada whispered. "It's not." Isabel shook her head violently. "No, this isn't real. My parents." She stopped, her voice cracking. "My parents," she repeated, and this time, her voice was smaller. Ada reached for her hand, but Isabel jerked away. "No," she said, her breathing growing rapid. "No, I don't believe this." Ada swallowed past the lump in her throat. "I know this is overwhelming," she said gently. "But I swear to you, it's true." Isabel's hands were clenched into fists. "Then where have you been all my life?" Ada sucked in a breath. "I never stopped looking for you. You were taken, Isabel. Kidnapped." Tears welled in Isabel's eyes. No, I wasn't kidnapped. I was adopted." Ada shook her head. "No, you weren't." Isabel's lip trembled. "My mother. She wouldn't." "She's not your mother," Ada said, her voice firmer now. Isabel's shoulders shook as the truth began to settle into place. Ada saw it in her face, the moment her heart broke. "My whole life," Isabel whispered. It was a lie. Ada nodded, her own tears falling freely. Yes, baby, but I'm here now. Isabel's face twisted in pain. I don't know what to believe. Ada reached out again, and this time, Isabel didn't pull away. My sweet girl, Ada whispered. You don't have to figure it all out right now. But know this, I have loved you every single day since you were taken from me. A sob tore through Isabel's throat. And then she fell into Ada's arms. Justice must be served. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Isabel was lost, struggling to reconcile the truth with the life she had always known. But one thing was clear. Margaret had to face the consequences. With Isabel's support, Ada took the evidence to the authorities. Margaret Monroe was arrested, charged with child abduction. For the first time in 22 years, justice was served. Richard, despite his role in keeping the truth hidden, was not charged, though Isabel never looked at him the same way again. But even with justice, the scars remained. Isabel was torn between love and betrayal, between her past and present. Rebuilding her relationship with Ada would take time. But at least now, they had that time. For the first time in decades, Ada woke up knowing her daughter was alive. And no one would ever take her away again. A new beginning. Months passed. Isabel and Ada spent time together, learning about each other, rebuilding what was stolen. It wasn't easy. There were days filled with anger, days filled with grief, but there were also days filled with love. And slowly, bit by bit, they began to heal. On a crisp autumn morning, Isabel sat beside Ada on the porch, sipping tea. She turned to her and smiled, soft, hesitant, but real. I'd like to hear more about my childhood, she said. Ada's heart swelled, and for the first time, in 22 years, she told her daughter the stories she had longed to share. Stories of love, of laughter, of a bond that not even time or tragedy could break. And in that moment, Ada knew. She had her daughter back, and nothing in the world could take her away again.